considering efforts to make these systems more affordable? That seems to be the
Yeah, so there's there's a lot of discussion these days about how to make these systems more affordable. Let me just say there is no easy answer to that. The two technologies people talk about are rail guns and lasers. Well, lasers for boost phase maybe, but I sort of somewhat glossed over it, but I tried to give you a feel that lasers for boost phase were way off in the distance. Not just the laser power, but the platform getting it close enough to the adversary. Boost phase against North Korea might work in 10, 20 years, but not against any of the other countries that we're worried about. Rail guns, another technology you hear about, these are basically electromagnetic howitzers. You know, instead of having gunpowder to propel the projectile, they do it with electromagnetic energy. These things have been offered up as missile defense systems. They're decades away from working, or at least a decade or more away from working. And even when they do work, they're point defenses, terminal defenses. So yeah, I could put a rail gun around, I have to put about 10 of them around San Francisco, and I might be able to defend it. But these are not continental defenses. So one of the two technologies is really not even applicable to compensating for the mid-course defenses that we currently are pursuing. How to make mid-course or the hit-to-kill interceptors cheaper? Nobody's come up with any idea yet, at least not one that's convincing. So it's tough. So there is a move afoot in the Pentagon to go to what they call pre-boost phase defense. That is before the boost phase. That's counterforce. So you'll see many people in the Pentagon are now saying, this missile defense stuff is great, live in it, okay, you guys have your systems out there, but their focus ought to be on offensive strike. Go after those missiles before they ever get launched. And so that's how a lot of people answer the question about how to make this more effective. Let me catch this gentleman.
What do you think about the prospects of cyber and electronic warfare as defense principles?
Cyber? Well, that's again one of these squirrely things that people talk about. Who knows what cyber is going to do? Yeah, we just don't know what cyber can do. We don't know how you get it into a. So, cyber for missile defense. The North Koreans have a ballistic missile. They've got a guidance system on it, and a nuclear warhead package on it. That thing is autonomous. How do we get in there? It's not like it's connected to the internet, right? So you have to get into the supply chain and the guidance system that comes from somewhere. Maybe they build it at home, and you have to put some cyber, some virus, something or other to screw up that guidance system so it doesn't function properly. That's not easy to do. It's not easy to get access to the supply chain, not easy to put that in there. As soon as they modify the thing, they may wipe out the little cyber thing you've got embedded in there. So cyber is one of these squirrely areas that, could have a huge effect in lots of different scenarios, like taking down the power grid, anything that's connected to the internet and relies on computers is potentially vulnerable to cyber attacks. Missiles are not really of that sort. So my own view is it's probably not going to do much. Actually, cyber against missile defense systems, I get into the software for that radar and I screw it up, that's much more worrisome. So if anything, cyber is going to be more effective against defensive systems than offensive systems.
Well, I was also asking, like, cyber in conjunction with electronic warfare, like targeted jamming of if you could infiltrate with frequency.
So you're thinking of the Chinese scenario, DF-21s, that kind of thing. So there's a whole set of things that one can do in principle in the area of electronic warfare to defeat systems. You could try to jam that seeker. I mentioned DF-21 comes into the atmosphere, starts maneuvering, opens up a seeker, and tries to find the carrier. Well, I start jamming that seeker if I understand how well it operates. Yeah, it gets into a very complicated business. So you can try to use electronic warfare as a tool to defeat seekers, but there's a lot of sophisticated techniques that adversaries use to defeat electronic warfare. Goes back and forth. How well do I know how well that seeker operates, what wavelength does it operate in, how do they do the signal processing and the radar return, all that stuff. And so it's actually a very active area, both in Russia, China, the United States, but there's not a lot one can really say about it that's definitive. As though what I've said about missile defense is definitive. Anybody else?
Any comments about the hypersonic glide? No offense to the-
So hypersonic glide vehicles, they're launched by rockets, they're boosted by rockets, and then they tip the rocket over and they release this glide vehicle that comes back down into the atmosphere and actually skips off the atmosphere. It uses aerodynamic maneuver to fly potentially very long ranges. The Chinese, we were testing ones of medium range. We actually tried to test ones of intercontinental range and they all failed. The Chinese have a very active program on hypersonic vehicles, and theirs have actually been working quite well. So these things come in and they start plowing through the atmosphere, gliding just under the kinetic energy that they got from the rocket booster. They fly down in the atmosphere, so all the exo-atmospheric interceptors are immediately useless. The only ones left are the terminal defenses. So now these things come in and they maneuver towards the target, and they can potentially maneuver with quite high accelerations as they home on some target or try to hit some target. Question is, can they outmaneuver our interceptors? And our interceptors have very high maneuver capability as well. So it's a little offense-defense game there. So we're not exactly defenseless against them, but our major continental air defense, continental missile defenses, the ground-based interceptor, the SM-3, the ones that defend huge areas, those footprints I showed you earlier, all mid-course, exo-atmospheric, those are defeated right off the bat if I have a hypersonic boost glide. So that also is a very active area of research in the Missile Defense Agency and other places to try to design interceptors that can go after these things and defeat them. But it's a real tough problem.
I think this New York Times article very much overplayed the American capability and the results of American research, and very much underplayed the Chinese and Russian demonstrated capabilities. So there's also, there are degrees of boost glide vehicles. I mean, there are these things, the pictures in the article show these continental boost glide vehicles that are like hypersonic airplanes. You can have very simple reentry bodies that just have little diverters, and they don't have as much of a divert capability. It's hard, and they're succeeding better than we are.
Question. So it's two questions. So the first one is, are all of the missile defense one-to-one? Like, is it,
One interceptor per, yeah. Right.
And is,
One inbound warhead, one interceptor.
and is there any, scalability to this? Like, can you not have it be one-to-one?
Well, so there's a new multiple object kill vehicle being designed by this company down the street, Lockheed Martin. And what they're trying to do is merge the end of the interceptor. So they put 3 or 4. So the problem with that is that I can't spread those multiple kill vehicles very far apart.
Do the same height, basically.
Yeah, right. So that same field of view. So where it's really useful is if the adversary has very sophisticated decoys that I have a hard time discriminating with that telescope. Now I rank order them in priority. This one is the one I think the most, so send one against it, or send 2 of them against that. This one could be, send one against that. This one might be, send one against that. And this one may be, why don't I send the last one against that? So if I have a hard time discriminating sophisticated decoys, multiple object kill vehicle deals with that problem. So the decoy discrimination, the debate out there in public, they often talk about this decoy discrimination as though it's binary. You can, you can't. It's a probabilistic thing. So if I can tell 90% of the time which is the real warhead, is that good discrimination or not? Well, sounds pretty good, 90%. But in fact, that means 10% of the time I go after the wrong thing. So if I shoot one interceptor per threat, 10% of the time, the real warhead gets through. And if that's a nuclear warhead, that's not very good.
This is the best decoy over real warhead.
Well, yeah, so we went through this in the 60s and 70s. We were trying to design decoys against the Soviet, Russian nascent ballistic missile defense system. And we were doing all kinds of fancy things to try to fool those radars, and they weren't very sophisticated radars, by the way. And eventually, we sort of realized that, well, the best decoy is not a warhead, and that was one of the rationales for the MIRV program. So instead of wasting all that payload weight on decoys that were getting heavier and heavier, by the way, that's what, because to make them really simulate real warheads down in the atmosphere, you had to have mass behind those things. They started getting heavier and heavier and heavier, and then eventually they just said, well, just make it another warhead. Then they have to shoot at it.
So the Poseidon missile could carry 14 nuclear warheads. It was designed to do. And that was, in fact, the most miniature warhead we could build.
Okay, so then the contrast to that question, right, is let's say you take that to a limit and you say you can scale, it's not 1 to 1, it's 1 to however many warheads you have coming at you in principle. Then what is, if it's always destabilizing, if you have a viable contention, what is the threat in ballistic missile defense, right? So like as soon as it becomes competitive, as soon as your defense becomes on order of magnitude as the offense, you were saying that it becomes destabilizing. Right. So where's the market for like a successful missile defense?
So you stated it accurately. When the missile defense becomes comparable, like 50% the size of the offensive arsenal you're trying to defend against, that is the region where things tend to get destabilizing in the classic sense, in the arms control sense.
I mean, it's also this situation that you would have in defense, right? Like a high probability.
Yeah, but so none of the defenses we're talking about are anywhere near that, at least vis-a-vis China and Russia. And so this is why the Ballistic Missile Defense Review states in there, our missile defense is not being designed against Russia, nor is it being designed against Chinese, how's the language, against Chinese strategic nuclear systems. Okay. And what's not quite clear is, well, what about the Chinese theater ballistic missile system? And the answer is, it is most definitely it's Chinese theater range ballistic missile, conventional. So
of course,
I'm not quite sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, so for specific, like, perimeter space, missile defense, ballistic missile defense is great, but it's not a multi-tool for everything. Because it's not going to become a go-to total defense system.
Israel, did you say? That's the word.
I didn't say it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, but they aren't just like global watchdog, right? They're not worried about defending things outside of the territory of the Iron Dome.
Yeah, the Iron Dome defends just one neighborhood.
Right.
It's a truly point defense against mortars and short-range rockets.
So then this defense is for us is strong for a very specific purpose. It's for these
a very limited purpose is the language I use. So what if there's an accidental missile launched out of Russia? Or it's just one missile, or for that matter, out of North Korea. We don't know what their command and control system's like, or their control of their nuclear forces. What if one gets launched in Seoul? So for those scenarios, accidental launch, you got 1 or 2 inbound, you really would like to have a missile defense shoot that down rather than have the thing detonate and then try to manage escalation after that. So yeah, it's all these systems are being designed for a very limited set of strategic rationales. It's accidental launch, it's removing those low rungs of the escalation ladder. If they're ballistic missile escalation, if they're cruise missiles, that's another story. Except against, say, a country like North Korea, but even North Korea, Scud-Bs and Scud-Cs that target South Korea, they've got those in the hundreds. And we only have a very thin, relative to that size of threat, we have a very thin missile defense system in South Korea today. And there's talk about it, as I mentioned earlier, upgrading it with THAAD, but it's a very contentious political debate. The Chinese are not keen on it. So yeah, everything it's very limited. We're not getting to the point where any of these systems could defend against half of a large arsenal. And even they couldn't defend against half of an arsenal from Iran, for that matter.
So then Scuds become the decoys themselves. Right?
I'm sorry,
The Scuds become the decoys themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, you can launch 100 Scuds and have 2 nukes in there.
Yeah, right.
Which one do you hit?
We should close it down pretty soon, about an hour over. I don't want to close it up with this terrific discussion, lots of ideas, but just 1 or 2 more. And then
So you mentioned that you believe that the course defense like SM-3 is more questionably effective against countries like Russia. The European theater, since currently we only have 1 beaches ashore in Romania and there's only 4 beach shores in Rhoda, what is, and they all have SM-3s, is there something backing up that can make that missile defense more effective, or what would that DMD mission in Europe be if they're all SM-3s and you believe that the SM-3s aren't that effective against a country like Russia?
So the Russians complain about the European missile defense system, those 2 sites that I showed, as having the capability to intercept their ICBMs. And so they're calling the European missile defense destabilized. Well, as we just went through these arguments, there's 24 interceptors at each of those sites. I also wrote a paper some time back looking at the technical capability of the European phase adaptive, and you can't catch the Russian ICBMs. So that issue of the kill vehicle has to be at the same point in space at the same time for an intercept. When you look at the launch of Russian ICBMs up over the pole towards us, you look at when sensors first see and track that, you launch that interceptor out of Poland, forget the one in Romania, it's way too far south, you simply can't catch it. It's just the laws of physics will tell you that the European phase adaptive system has no capability to intercept Russian ICBMs or SLBMs. And even if it did, it's 24 interceptors.
Doesn't it depend on where they're going?
Sorry?
Doesn't it depend on where they're going?
Well, so if they're heading towards Europe, that's a different story. So if they launch ballistic missiles towards Europe, then the EPA will potentially work. Now, there's a couple of caveats. We actually don't, the EPA has no sensors that are looking out towards Russia, down towards the Middle East. But yeah, you can put a big radar there in the Middle East, in Europe, like we originally proposed with the Bush administration program that could look out over Russia. Russia doesn't have any IRBMs, INF treaty. Bruce mentioned a couple systems that are kind of nibbling at the edges of the INF treaty, so they may be deploying missiles with that type of range. If they intend to use those to threaten Europe, now we get to that strategic argument. They've got a small number of IRBMs, MRBMs that could threaten Europe. That EPAA can potentially intercept those, so it takes the small escalation options off the table. And I think you probably heard about the Russian strategy these days is escalate to nuclear attack to de-escalate. So some people are saying this is exactly what the Russians are thinking of, is launching a couple nuclear weapons at NATO to try to force NATO to stop whatever it's doing, like trying to defend the Baltic states or whatever conflict scenario you have, where the Russians are trying to force the termination of the conflict on terms favorable to them. They might launch 1 or 2 nuclear weapons towards Europe. That's when the EPA would be extremely effective and it would be a very useful strategic capability to have to deny those simple attack options. Now Russia's got to launch 30 or 40 of those, or 30, let's say, IRBMs to saturate the 24 interceptors. So now they have to have 30, which is harder to do if you're still living within the INF treaty. Maybe they withdraw from the INF treaty. But 30 inbound IRBMs is not going to look limited. And then the Russian leaders have to think, geez, is NATO going to interpret this as a limited attack to try to de-escalate? Or does the balloon just go up? And all of a sudden, the United States starts alerting its strategic systems, and an hour later, you've got global nuclear war, the sort that we used to worry about for 50, 60 years. So EPAA could be useful, at least from a NATO perspective, against a possible threat coming out of Russia. But the one that you hear most of the Russian leaders talk about is our ability, EPA's ability to intercept their ICBMs heading towards the United States. And that's just bogus. That almost violates the laws of physics. That does not mean they've changed their narrative.
Well, I think we are going to that to Dr. Goodwin and Dr. Bush for giving the fantastic presentations we've learned this time. It's good. So if you'd like to just take a break and try and start to and then we're going to get into simulation I guess.
Yeah, but let me know.
I get that.
No, that's a long goal at this point now. But right now I'm working on the yeah, exactly. I'm going to go to I'm going to go to NNSA. So, are you okay posting our slides for the video one.
I didn't think of it. Actually, no, I didn't hear what he said.
Because he is launching families in some states. So we're going to help nuclear nations develop capability and better hiding the nuclear weapons. Yeah. So we're going to build. I didn't fully hear your question.